Let's talk about the miracle of the Australian economy. What happened? Well, government intervention happened.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Big public spending.
Big public spending. So big that we accidentally gave $40 billion to companies whose revenues went up during the crisis. $40 billion, to which the Treasurer says, no biggie, don't worry. So big picture, government intervention was what kept the economy going, and every CEO in the country was begging for it. Didn't hear any of them saying, no, don't send it my way.
Small government.
Small government. Let the market fix it. Didn't hear a peep out of them.
And one for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. A banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're bringing you the first of a special series of podcasts that we're going to do with our Chief Economist, Richard Dennis, and some guests, based on his new book, Big, The Role of the State in the Modern Economy. Big is published by Monash University Publishing as part of their In the National Interest series. And over the coming weeks, we're going to be asking different experts and advocates, not about the size of our economy, but about the shape of it. Because that's essentially what the new book, Big, is all about. Who we elect determines which problems we solve, says Richard Dennis. And for decades we've been told that small government, privatisation and tax cuts would be a rising tide that lifts all boats. But the pandemic has shown us that the state has and will continue to play a huge role in the modern economy. The suggestion that government spending, regulation and ownership can significantly improve the lives of Australians is so derided it's almost never discussed in public discourse.
We have sensibly and safely taken governments to a position where they are getting out of people's lives. That's what the National Plan was about. The National Plan was not about entrenching government in people's lives. It was about getting government out of people's lives.
All they can do is spend, tax, lifting the rate of debt and deficit to levels Australia has never seen before.
The reason we've got empty supermarket shelves, the reason why you can't get a rapid antigen test, the reason why people's summer have been ruined, small businesses are getting smashed, is because the government didn't order enough tests in the first place.
So to talk to us about the role of the state in the modern economy, I'm joined by Richard Dennis. G'day, Richard.
Hey, Eb.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you very much.
I'm a little confused, though, because I thought we were getting government out of people's lives. Why is now the time to write a book about bigger government?
Exactly. I like to be contrary. No, let's be clear. I want to get government out of lives. I think voluntary euthanasia is a great idea. I think that we should have more freedoms of speech in Australia. The way we're using defamation law to silence debate, it's terrifying. And it was, of course, the government that created those defamation laws. And whether it's illicit drugs or the right to die with dignity, there's all sorts of regulation that I'd like to see removed. But I'm also happy with new regulations. A lot of what we've just gone through with COVID, sure, it's been inconvenient at times, but there's no doubt the death rate in Australia was so much lower because state in particular and federal government stepped in and made new regulations to protect us. So I think we have to be very careful of framing the question as should we have more regulation or less, and focus more on do we need more regulation of some things and less regulation of some things. And the same for spending. I think more government spending on aged care or childcare would be great, and less government spending on prisons on Nauru for refugees would be great.
Yeah.
So I think we have to avoid the idea that public spending is good or bad and regulation is good or bad, and make room for a democratic debate in the middle about what kind of regulation and what kind of spending.
The cost of the NDIS is forecast to blow out to $40 billion within 3 years, fueling debate about the sustainability of the scheme.
This government is shabbily and secretly cutting the strands of the net so people just fall through it.
The President of Australia's peak disability rights body says hundreds of families have contacted them after having their funding slashed.
You talk about, for decades, we've been told that kind of small government is better. What does economics have to say about that?
Well, it says nothing. Look, really, we've been told for decades, as you said, that, the smaller that we make the government, the more efficient the economy will be. That's not written down in any textbook anywhere. It's not based on any theory. Just like there's no right amount for you to spend on takeaway food, no right amount for me to spend on a new car, there's no right amount for Australia to spend on public health. These choices have to represent our preferences and our priorities. And people in other countries spend a lot more money on public health than us, and they have much better systems than us. And they don't have expensive private health insurance, and they don't have expensive co-payments. Now, is that right or wrong? Well, I've got my preferences, but that's not economics. So, yeah, we've been told if we just spend less on important things, we'll all be better off. Well, no, literally the highest income countries in the world with the highest rates of productivity growth have been, the Nordic countries, for example, which have much higher levels of tax than us, much bigger public sectors than us, and much stronger economies than ours, and much happier citizens.
There's a big theme running throughout the book that if we deride the idea that government spending and regulation can actually improve people's lives, is it any wonder that people become disillusioned? What's the link between a healthy economy and a healthy democracy?
Look, I think it's really strong, and we're only just beginning to see how strong, because at the moment we've got a lot of young people in Australia and in democracies around the world who increasingly think that democracy's not that flash. And, if you think about it, when was the last time democracy and the role of government had any good press? For decades we've been told that government spending is inefficient, that governments waste money, that taxes are a burden, it's a backpack of bricks that we carry around on our back as we trudge through our day carrying our tax burden. So we attack taxes, we attack government spending, politicians call each other liars and corrupt all day. Well, guess what? There's a whole generation of people that have grown up without hearing that the government might be able to improve their lives. If housing's unaffordable, let us step in with policy that works. Education's really expensive. How about we make it free, like Gough Whitlam did, but also like Germany still has free university education. So you can't blame a lot of young people for losing faith in a democratic project, which they've never heard a good word spoken of, and which, frankly, they haven't actually had much back in return from.
And in the book, you do go back in history to kind of look at big things that government was able to achieve that improved people's lives, like Medicare and the sewerage system and other things like that. Historically, what are the big interventions that other prime ministers have put in place?
Where to start? Everything you take for granted that's good, right? All of the roads, right? Nearly all of the roads in Australia, I should say nearly all of the roads in Australia built by government. The coal-fired power stations, the electricity wires, all of that. It wasn't the market that built them, that was state governments. Turn on a tap and get some water. Guess who? All of the telecommunications infrastructure that we take for granted. Well, Telstra used to be Telecom and it was government-owned. So it was government that rolled out all of that infrastructure. It educated the vast majority of our people. Most people were born in public hospitals. Gough Whitlam gave us free higher education, but we already had free primary school and free high school. Where do you think that came?
Yeah, and I was really interested in the role that Menzies played in making housing affordable.
Absolutely. Politically, economically and democratically, he thought that if people could afford their own homes, if they could buy their own homes and literally invest in their community and put down roots, that was not just kind of good for them. He thought it was good for Australia in the fight against communism, which was on his mind. And he also thought it was good politics because he thought, well, these are the kind of, hard-working, self-reliant types that I'm playing to. So if I help them buy a home, they'll remember that. So,
and they're going to be invested in the country, presumably.
Invested in the country, invested in the community, invested in themselves. And so Menzies was big on public housing and support for housing. And also Menzies was quite clear, and I quote him in the book, that he was really down on the idea that we should stigmatise anybody who's on welfare. If the government's made it available to you, you should be proud to get it. So, yeah, the Menzies tradition wasn't to pick on single mothers and to demonise the unemployed. On the contrary, he thought that making people feel guilty for getting welfare was effectively creating a form of servitude, which the liberal in him rejected.
I just want to say this to you. You have given us not only an enormous majority, but an enormous task.
And from his office in Parliament House, the Prime Minister undertook, among other things, the encouragement of all kinds of national development. The Australian economy steadily improved.
That's really interesting. That also stuck out to me because it so dominates the way we talk, particularly about entitlements for the unemployed. And I thought it was really interesting that you drew attention to that role of shame, that we want people to think there's nothing worse than being on unemployment, to feel ashamed if they need it. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Oh, yeah, shame has come to play a really important role in Australian politics and in the design of policy. So if, and I'm not amongst them, but if you wanted to cut taxes for high-income earners and spend less money on health and education and welfare, you know, there's only a small percentage of the population earn over 150 grand a year, and most people rely on a hell of a lot of government services. So if you wanted to create a political project to get people to support tax cuts for a small minority and spending cuts on a large majority, how do you do that? And one way is to make it shameful to be reliant on those services. So we've created the idea of self-funded retirees, and they're the ones that are allowed to be proud.
They're deserving.
They're the deserving rich, right? Whereas the age pension, oh, well...
Didn't save enough.
Didn't save enough, huh? Or chose to go into a low-paid caring profession and looked after other people your whole life.
Oh, yeah. Women are famous for choosing
They make bad choices, Ebony. We've spoken about this before. Women have to stop making bad choices, like caring for other people or taking time out of the workforce to care for their kids. So shame plays this really important role. And the clearest example is that, like, if you think about how Centrelink is notorious for treating people, we have this whole parallel bureaucracy called the Department of Veterans Affairs. And the whole purpose of the Department of Veterans Affairs is to make sure that veterans don't feel the shame that most Australians who need government pensions feel. Like, we know that we're shaming people in Centrelink, and we don't want to shame veterans. So we've created an expensive parallel duplicate welfare structure purely to isolate the deserving welfare recipients from the undeserving welfare recipients. And the other clear example, and by the way, I'm glad we pay veterans benefits. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't. But we shouldn't have a Centrelink that's so invested in shaming people that we wouldn't want a vet to ever walk into them.
There. Yeah.
But think about the shame that we've now attached to public housing. Well, we have this whole thing called the Defence Housing Authority to make sure that people who work in the army have nice houses.
Yeah.
That's fine. You know, so there's no stigma attached to living in a Defence Housing Authority home, but we've stigmatised a single parent bringing up a kid in public housing. Why? Well, because we want to.
Yeah.
Right? Because we want to spend less and less on that stuff, so we want everybody not to think, oh, isn't that nice? I wonder if that might help me one day. We've trained Australians to think, oh, yeah, you wouldn't want to rely on that, would you?
The government is preparing to crack down on more than 70,000 dole bludgers who are exploiting a medical loophole to avoid seeking work. Hotspots include Sydney's inner west, where over 30% of those on Newstart, youth allowance and single-parent payments claim they're not fit enough to look for a job. The Central Coast is the worst region, with over half using medical certificates to get out of compulsory job-seeking requirements.
Here's a quote from your book that really struck out to me. It is no coincidence that the democratic contest of big ideas has been replaced by debates about costings and modelling and confected culture wars. Talk to me about modelling.
Well, let's talk about culture wars as well. I mean, yeah, think about last week, and here was Scott Morrison bringing in his anti-discrimination bill to discriminate against people.
Yeah.
No, he was deliberately trying to pick a culture war, because he doesn't want to talk about COVID. And he doesn't
climate change.
Or climate change. He doesn't want to talk about any of the big things that are happening. So, he's literally just trying to goad people into having a fight about these other issues rather than confront or debate the big things that people really do care about. So, unfortunately, modern politics has evolved towards these confected fights about little things, and B, if we're going to have a conversation about something big like climate change or aged care funding or increasing unemployment benefits, we're not allowed to have an open democratic conversation about priorities and values and principles. Instead, we're forced to have a technocratic conversation about costings and modelling. And this is not an accident. It's a way that's deliberately designed to keep most people out of the conversation.
And it's not just the coalition that uses costings in that manner. It's kind of just become the way that we talk about policy.
Well, exactly, but I'd say it's the way we don't talk about policy.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So rather than...
Let's not talk about it, we can't afford it.
Can't
Look
afford
at the
it.
costings.
Well, or no, have you got costings, Ebony? Have you modelled that? Have you modelled that?
No.
Right, well then you be quiet. You go away and you come back in 2 years after you've paid $250,000 to someone to go do the modelling. So you're not just allowed to say, God, I think unemployment benefits are really low. I'd like to live in a country where if someone loses their job because the car industry gets shut down, that they don't fall into poverty. That's what I'd like, and I get a vote. Well, fine. That's the conversation we should have. But you're not allowed to just talk about, well, what kind of system do you want? What kind of rules for the system? What's enough money to live on? Everyone's got an opinion on that. So in order that we don't have to hear about everybody's opinion, we shut people down and say, where's your modelling? Where's your costing? And you know what? It's almost uniquely Australian. No one talks about economic modelling in the UK or the US in the way we do.
Do they care about budget surpluses?
No. The last president to deliver a budget surplus was Bill Clinton. In the US, the last Prime Minister in the UK was Tony Blair. No one cares. So I think, fish can't taste the water it swims in, and in Australia we don't know how weird our policy debate is. We're obsessed with budget surpluses in ways that few countries are. And the idea that a politician can't announce or state a preference for a new policy without elaborate costings and macroeconomic modelling and estimated indirect job. No, seriously, no other country plays politics that way.
Yeah.
And I don't think and let's look at the track record. Now that we're focused so much on costings and modelling, does anyone think things have got better?
A total joke.
That policy is indeed a total joke, Senator. Always was, actually.
When Australians needed their government to be going out and fixing aged care and actually buying rapid antigen tests, you established a little costings unit of Liberal staffers to cost Labor campaigns, commitments,
which
to
you
then
won't cost
splash
yourself.
on the
You won't
front
cost your
page
own
of the
policies.
Australian, which you then had to correct after trying to pretend they were costed by the finance department. What an absolute shambles.
The cost of policies actually matters, Senator, and you should be upfront at the time you announce them.
Speaking of kind of being distracted from the real issues, you talk about the fact that virtually everything Australians have been told about their tax system is nonsense.
Yep.
What did you mean by that?
I meant that. It's just all rubbish. Australia's a very low tax country by world standards.
No, that's not what I've heard.
No, exactly. Well, there are these, pinky lefto organisations like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. They publish all the data on a top secret thing called the internet. It's all available. We're a low tax country. We don't spend much compared to other developed countries. The top tax rate in Australia is not the highest in the world or anything like it, and high-performing countries have higher income tax rates than us, and they still attract scarce labour. They still have talented people work there. And of course, if the tax rate was the only thing that attracted or kept someone in a country, then all the migration in the world would be from rich countries to poor countries. But you know what? It's actually the other way around. A whole bunch of people want to leave low-tax countries and go to Northern Europe and get good jobs and pay high rates of tax.
Yeah.
So, we've just been told that this burden of tax will weigh us down and ruin our economy. But for 30 years, we've been cutting income taxes. For 30 years, we've been putting downward pressure on wages. For 30 years, we've been deregulating and privatising. And you know what? Productivity growth in the Scandinavian countries left us for dead. And they've not gone down that road. But again, in Australia, it's just not polite to talk about Europe. Like, just don't mention the war. No, don't mention the continent.
And if we had bigger ambitions for the role that government could play in our lives and we wanted to spend a lot more on health and those types of things, I mean, how much more tax revenue are the Nordic countries pulling in than Australia? How much more could we have to kind of play around with?
Oh, there's a lot of money there, Eb.
Ooh, really?
Well, let's use round numbers. In Australia, we collect around 25% of GDP in tax. In some of the Scandinavian countries, it's more like 50.
Double.
Not quite, but yeah. So there's a little bit of coin laying around, if we wanted to. And this is the point. And I'm not saying we have to double our tax collections tomorrow. We don't. We can increase spending tomorrow. We don't have to have a budget surplus every year. They certainly don't in the US or the UK or anywhere else. But in the long run, if you want to have a much bigger public sector, you do need to collect more tax. There's no doubt about that. But in Australia, we've just been told for so long that we, quote, can't afford to do things. But the stage 3 tax cuts that are about to come in will start in their first year. They're going to cost $15 billion. And by 2030, they're going to cost $30 billion a year. And when that was introduced and someone said, where will the money come from? The answer was, the economy will grow. It'll be fine.
It'll all come out in the wash.
It'll come out in the wash. What are you worried about? It's only $30 billion a year. We only spend 20-something on aged care in totality.
Okay, but on this now, we've spoken the last couple of weeks about budget repair. Now, unemployment going so well, and the economy as a whole going so well, is this an expense that is needed, in your opinion?
Well, again, I don't see tax cuts as an expense. What I do see them as strengthening the economy and allowing Australians to keep more of what they earn.
And, when we ditched the $90 billion worth of subs, well, we're going to get nuclear ones, maybe. How much are they going to cost? Dunno.
Blank check.
Blank check.
Whatever it takes.
Literally, the Prime Minister said, whatever it takes. Well, when the Aged Care Royal Commission said we needed to spend a lot more money on aged care, well, that's worthy words, but where's the money going to come from? So let's be clear. When it's tax cuts for high-income earners, don't worry about the budget. When it's nuclear submarines that no one even knew we needed, don't worry about the budget. Or you want to spend some money on healthcare or aged care or childcare. Oh, geez, money doesn't grow on trees, So we need, and I'm not saying money doesn't matter. In the long run, again, you want to have a bigger public sector, then you're going to need to collect more tax. The high-spending Nordic countries are the high-taxing countries. There's no coincidence about that. In the short run, doesn't matter. We've seen that with COVID, $200 billion deficit. Don't worry about it, Ed.
Don't worry about it. Yep.
Don't worry, it's fine. And they're right.
Yeah.
Like, just to be clear, that's not the problem. But in the long run, if we want to have a bigger public sector, we'll have to collect more tax. And sure, that would make us look more like the richest, most productive, happiest countries in the world. So there's the downside.
Yeah.
We'd look more like them.
It sounds terrible.
Oh,
but I was going to say, I did hear the former Treasury Secretary Ken Henry on Radio National this morning, and he made a very similar point to you. He kind of said, well, we need to think about what it is that we want to do and then have a conversation about, how we could get the revenue for that. But he also kind of talked about overall tax reform, and you can't just talk about little pieces here and there.
Well, the purpose of taxation is simply to raise sufficient revenue to fund the activities of government, and our tax system is simply incapable of doing that. We know that because the government has published 40-year projections of the budget deficit, and in no year, in not one of those 40 years, does the budget come back to balance. It's in deficit, and the deficit gets bigger and bigger as the years go by. So the tax system is incapable of doing what it's there to do, which is to raise sufficient revenue to fund the activities of government.
We've talked a little bit about the types of services that we'd like you and I to invest in, and we think that other Australians might want to have more funding for. But when it comes to tax reform, we're about to head into a budget. We're about to head into an election. What's missing from our tax reform debate?
Ideas. Like, we've kind of got this 30-year-old to-do list of what tax reform looks like in Australia. And like most of the unfinished reform agenda from the 90s, we should just chuck it out and figure out something that's fit for purpose. Look, the first principle is, step one, how much money do you want to spend on stuff is the key thing. Like, the purpose of tax is to make room in the economy for the kind of services we want. So that's the first principle. Let's start with, how do you want your kids to have a better education or a worse one? Do you want aged care to be better or worse? What do we want? And then how do we collect more tax? Well, the first principle would be put taxes on things you want to discourage. So just as we tax tobacco and alcohol, obviously we need a tax on carbon pollution. It's almost not an economist in the world that disagrees, certainly not one that doesn't work with the fossil fuel industry. So why, if we're going to have a debate about tax reform, great. How about we put a nice big carbon tax on the things we're trying to discourage? And by the way, let's stop subsidising fossil fuels while we're at it.
That might help too.
That would help a lot. So let's get rid of subsidies for things we don't want. Let's put taxes on things that we're trying to discourage. Ken Henry himself, the Henry Tax Review, one of its key recommendations was we should collect more tax from the resources industry. Well, guess what? We didn't. But the idea is still a good one. And Australia is now in the bizarre situation that while our gas exports have gone through the roof, the revenue we collect on gas exports has actually declined. We overtook Qatar to become the biggest exporter of gas in the world a few years ago, and Qatar collects 20 times as much tax on gas as we do. So, we need to tax pollution. We need to tax the enormous profits that some people make out of fossil fuel and other mineral extractions. People go on and on about reforming the GST. Fine. Stick it on private school fees. I don't mind. Stick it on private health insurance. I don't mind. But the people who get very brave and say we have to broaden the base of the GST and put it on fresh food, well, how is taxing bananas more important than taxing private school fees?
Yeah.
So, look, there's plenty we can do to collect more tax, to collect it more fairly, to collect it more efficiently. But the big ticket items get ignored. Enormous tax-free capital gains from people selling $10 million family homes, that matters, but here we are giving $9,000 a year tax cuts to high-income earners, saying that's going to, boost labour force participation amongst rich older blokes. Like, don't worry about them.
I think they're doing all right.
I think they're doing all right, and we know that actually it's low-paid women working in the caring sector who can't afford the cost of childcare. That's where we need to boost participation, and all the economists on the side of cut income taxes to help the economy know that we'd get a lot more bang for our buck if we aimed it at the care sector and free childcare, for example.
Coming back to where we started, you're not a fan of big government just for the sake of big government.
God, no.
Talk to me about the Productivity Commission.
Absolutely. There are some things governments can do better than the private sector, and education is one of them, health is one of them, police is one of them.
Sewerage.
No one wants a user-pays sewage system, all right? Just like we need free rats because we don't want to discourage people from taking a test, user-paid sewerage, you don't want to discourage people using the loo. So governments do all sorts of things well, they do some things not so well, and we need to have a democratic debate about which is which. And I can't remember what your actual question was.
The Productivity Commission.
The Productivity Commission.
The Productivity Commission is an independent research and advisory agency for the Australian Government.
While the government largely determines our work program, our findings and recommendations are independent and based on our own analysis and judgment.
Not only do we look at economic issues, but social and environmental issues too.
Our research and policy advice can help governments improve or create better policies to benefit all Australians.
Because the Productivity Commission are just obsessed with privatisation and deregulation, they can't actually answer simple questions like what does government do well? Their answer is kind of nothing. So, the Productivity Commission is another one of these legacy items from the 1990s. And ever since we've had the Productivity Commission, Australia's productivity growth has declined. Yep. So they have failed. They have failed spectacularly. We should call them the Unproductivity Commission. And I'd suggest we'd need to replace them with something like a Wellbeing Commission or a National Interest Commission that basically can look at the big challenges we face in a much broader context and think, all right, if we wanted to, save the Murray River and still have farming along the Murray, how do we get that balance right? Yeah. Or if we want to save koalas and not stop a new house ever getting built again in New South Wales, how do we get that right? These are complicated. And how best do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions in ways that are effective and fair? There's no point asking the Productivity Commission any of those questions, right? Because their answer will be deregulate, get out of the way, let the market rip. Well, it's never worked. And again, they can't even deliver what it says on the logo.
Yeah, so let's take the opposite tack and the Nordic view of things. What does productivity look like in the Nordic countries if they went in the opposite direction?
Well, productivity growth has outstripped Australia's productivity growth in those Nordic countries over the entire period where we've been obsessed with deregulation and cutting wages and cutting taxes. Why? Well, because they still continue to invest a lot in their education system, not just spraying it around everywhere the way we do in Australia, including the private schools that are so rich they've got their own equestrian centres. Like, it's nice to learn dressage at school. Like, I get that for the horsey people, right? But the idea that the taxpayer is putting money into the dressage arena, are we really surprised that the returns from that for the productivity benefits are low? So we kind of spend a lot on these inefficient private schools and private hospitals, which don't boost productivity. The Scandinavian countries don't. They focus it. They still do much. They have much higher quality technical and further education. Our apprenticeship system has been broken by that kind of same neoliberal agenda. They've invested in the infrastructure they've needed, but also, and this is not, it sounds counterintuitive, but it's quite straightforward economics. When you have high paid workforce with secure jobs, their employers try to get the most out of them, right? Because if you're paying someone a lot, you want to make sure they're productive. So high wages actually boost productivity. And similarly, if your workforce is happy and not turning over all the time, they get better and better at their job. There's more learning on the job. People are more cohesive. We've created this stretched, casualised gig labour market that no one thinks is productive. It's cheap, but it's not.
But that's all it is.
But that's all it is. So the Scandinavian countries have pursued a radically different path to the Productivity Commission's preferred agenda, and they've delivered much better results. So if we do evidence-based policy, let's look at the evidence and scrap the Productivity Commission.
How is this possible, debt just as far as the eye can see, when for a decade the Coalition did not stop railing about the evils of leaving future generations to pay off debt?
Well, let me remind you, when we went into this crisis, we had delivered the first balanced budget in 11 years.
But I don't want to get back into the back in black thing, and I'm surprised that you raised it actually. But let me make the point. My point is, as you well know, Treasurer, that the Coalition's rhetoric on debt was that it was pure evil, and now you're arguing when it's needed that you embrace it. It's a total shift in rhetoric.
Well, you're raising a historical case, so let me raise one with you.
So just to finish up, I wanted to ask you to reflect on what the pandemic has revealed about our economy and the role of the state, because I feel like the minute it hit, after a bit of persuasion, it really turned kind of 10 or 20 years of economic orthodoxy in Australia on its head, and we had big government interventions, and it just became clear that there was a huge role for the state that wasn't obvious previously.
Absolutely. So, yeah, what do we know? We know that when there's a crisis, no one wants the market to fix it. Not even the so-called market. So at a big picture level, the federal government stepped in with enormous fiscal stimulus straight out of the Keynesian playbook, which they should have done. They abandoned the idea that the budget surplus mattered, which they should have done. So they pumped $200 billion into the economy to prop it up, and it worked. So now we've got all these people saying, oh, let's talk about the miracle of the Australian economy. What happened? Well, government intervention happened.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Big public spending.
Big public spending. So big that we accidentally gave $40 billion to companies whose revenues went up during the crisis. $40 billion, to which the Treasurer says, no biggie. Don't worry. Don't worry about that. 40 billion. And he's kind of right, because that's how rich we are.
Yeah.
Like, we can lose the odd 40 billion. Doesn't really even make a big difference. So, big picture, government intervention was what kept the economy going, and every CEO in the country was begging for it. Didn't hear any of them saying, no, don't send it my way. Small government. Let the market fix it. Didn't hear a peep out of them. So, that was good. And then, of course, it wasn't the private sector that organised our testing and tracing and isolation and quarantine. It wasn't the private sector that kind of came up with all the rules. We all looked to our government and said, all right, how do we get through this crisis? And a lot of the rules were inconvenient. A lot of the rules were annoying. But people still knew that we needed, just like we don't let people decide which side of the road to drive on or how drunk they feel like being when they're driving on the road.
Yes, I quite like that red tape.
Yeah, exactly. Red tape keeps us safe every day. It keeps us safe in the workplace. It keeps us safe on the roads. It keeps us safe when we're shopping. And red tape and regulation kept us safe as well. And again, if there was a complaint from businesses that the governments weren't being clear enough, at one point, the business community was quite concerned about, well, what are our legal obligations to our staff when it comes to vaccinations? And Scott Morrison went, oh, well, you sort that out. And the business community as one said, no, please come up with some rules, come up with some red tape, come up with some regulation and tell us what to do, because then we'll do it. But it's your job to lead us through this stuff. And then, of course, flipping the debate, in the lead up to Christmas, you had all the business community in New South Wales saying, red tape, regulation, COVID restrictions are killing us, let it rip, let it rip. Well, we did. And what happened? Now they're saying, give me money. No one's coming to my shop.
Yeah, turns out people don't necessarily want to go out to a cafe if they think they're going to get Omicron.
So when we were listening to the health experts, we actually, strangely enough, made better health decisions than when we started listening.
Better economic decisions.
Better economic decisions. And then, so we've let that genie out of the bottle now. But I guess my point is, when the government was in there leading and regulating and spending money, things went much better in Australia than they did in other parts of the world.
Yeah, certainly that lesson was well learned by countries like the UK after the GFC.
Yeah.
Richard, we're heading towards a budget. If you were Treasurer, what would be some of your priorities just to finish up?
Well, if I were Treasurer in this government, I'd be thinking, how am I going to get myself re-elected? So I think it's safe to say that there won't be much talk about the budget deficit, and there will be tax cuts and lollies. I won't say all around, because this government's been very targeted in making sure that the lollies land in the handful of seats they care about, while the rest of us eat our gruel, living in the safe seats of Canberra. But if I were Treasurer and I had constitutional power to, make decisions on other people's behalf, something I don't aspire to, I'd care a lot more about the care sector. I think the key lesson from the crisis is that we rely most heavily on people who get the least. And whether that's the aged care sector, whether that's nurses.
It's time to let the government know that we've had no hope. They put us in an untenable and unfair situation. Enough is enough. We need the resources and we need the staff. And from the beginning, this pandemic has been ill-managed from the top down.
Or whether it's people driving trucks and working in warehouses. they are the essential workers. They are the wealth creators. But for decades, we've been told that the CEO earning $1 million a year needs a tax cut, or they won't be very motivated to work hard. I think it's time we admitted the opposite was true, and that we need to actually reward the people who, in some sense, demand the least. They work in the caring sector. They are caring. They want to look after their patients. They want to look after the people they're caring for. And we've seen how hard they work on our behalf.
Thanks so much, Richard, and congratulations again on the book. Democracy thrives on high expectations, and this conversation has certainly reached my sky-high expectations of all my favourite discussions of the economy with you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ebony. And yes, you can't have a democracy without politicians. We should be hard on them, but we can't get too cynical about politicians or democracy, because it needs us to care about it.
This episode was recorded on Tuesday the 15th of February 2022, and things may have changed since recording. We have a special discount for Follow the Money listeners on Richard's new book. Just head to publishing.monash.edu, select Big, and enter the discount code AusInstitute20. That discount code again is AUS Institute 20. When you check out Big at publishing.monash.edu. The name of the book, again, is Big, The Role of the State in the Modern Economy, and it's part of Monash University Publishing's In the National Interest series, and it should be out in all good bookshops, but we really encourage you to buy online and get that 20% discount, free shipping all across Australia. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _NTT, and Richard Dennis is at RDNS_TAI. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and you can find her at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Don't forget to leave us a review if you enjoy the podcast. It helps other people to find us. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.